obtaining relevant notes and information to understand what commitments were made by the President at the summit and the impact it will have on our foreign policy. The Russian ambassador last night said that, quote, important verbal agreements were made. Mr. President, we need to know the details of those agreements. Mr. President, empirical, objective truth has taken a beating for the last 18 months. I said from this pulpit in January that the dissemination of untruths has the effect of eroding trust in our vital institutions and conditioning the public to no longer trust them. As we saw in Helsinki on Monday, entertaining the untruths of a dictator has the same effect. Passing this resolution will let our constituents, the administration, our allies, and our adversaries know that here in the Senate, we do not entertain the deceit of dictators. The truth is, Russia interfered in our elections in 2016, and these efforts continue. Accepting that truth is the first step in preparing us to confront this malign activity. Let's pass this resolution. Mr. President, I ask for unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Res 583 submitted earlier today. I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Majority Whip.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, let me first thank the Senator from Arizona and the Senator from Delaware for expressing all of our concern about Russian interference in the 2016 election. It's absolutely clear they did, and the President has said as much on a number of occasions. Now, I agree in Helsinki, he was less than clear about that, but he came back and said that he misspoke and reaffirmed his earlier position that, yes, the Russian government had attempted to interfere in the election, although nobody disputes the fact that they were unsuccessful in changing a single vote or affecting the outcome. Ironically, the very same investigation, which has made clear that the Russians did attempt to disrupt the election, has also made clear there is no evidence of collusion that anybody has uncovered to date. So my concern is with this resolution is that it is purely a symbolic act, and what we need to do is not just offer symbolic resolutions on the floor. We need to do the hard work that senators have to do through the regular order. In other words, our committees that have jurisdiction over these issues ought to be permitted to call the witnesses and ask the hard questions and develop the record before we go on record as to a resolution like this. I would point out that the indictments that were referred to, apparently, according to published reports, Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, asked the President before Helsinki should he withhold announcement of those indictments or go ahead before the summit. And the President said, no, go ahead. Well, anybody who's read the 29 pages of the indictment issued at the request of Robert Mueller by a grand jury here in the District of Columbia knows there is chapter and verse of how Russians attempted to interfere with the election. It's a good and important read, but the President knew that before he went to Helsinki, so to me, it gives me some confidence that he did indeed misspeak, especially in light of his subsequent affirmations of Russian interference in the election. I happen to be privileged to sit on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. We have been conducting bipartisan investigation of the Russian matter for the entire time that the President has been in office, for the last year and a half. We've already issued some preliminary reports. That's the way to do our work, is through bipartisan committee work, have the witnesses come and testify, ask them hard questions, and render our judgment. I know that Secretary Pompeo is coming before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee sometime next week. He ought to be asked hard questions, and I'm confident he will respond to those questions. But that's how we get the information we need. Let me just say that I think we should consider sanctions, not sort of sense of the Senate resolutions that have no sting or no impact, certainly no deterrent effect on what we all want to discourage, which is Russian involvement in our 2018 elections. And that's why the majority leader today asked the chairman of the Banking and Foreign Relations Committee to hold hearings and recommend additional measures that could respond to or deter Russian malign behavior. That's the way we ought to do our work, through our committees of jurisdiction, because you know what? When we rush to judgment and we try to do resolutions like this, we can inadvertently make mistakes. And let me point out one that's in this resolution. There's a reference to the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which passed the Senate 98-2 to deter and punish election interference by the Russian Federation. There is a provision in the current conference committee on the Defense Authorization Committee that would issue a waiver of that act to our partner, India. Now, if we want to encourage countries like India to come into to partner with the United States of America, the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy, then we ought to be all about encouraging that movement toward us and away from the Russian Federation. And I worry there's no reference in here to the waiver provision in the Defense Authorization Conference Committee that India has asked for and that Secretary Mattis has requested that Congress grant. So all I'm asking for is a little bit of caution here that in the rush to issue a resolution, we, number one, I don't think acknowledge the full picture, but we also don't commit our work to the committees that have jurisdiction over these matters to do it carefully and thoughtfully in a bipartisan way so we come up with the best solution to the problem. So, Madam President, I just think this is the wrong way to go about it. I think our committees ought to continue to do their work. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Defense, Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, and the Banking Committee, and we ought to come up with the right kind of bipartisan answer, which I think could well be increased sanctions against the Russian Federation to deter them from meddling in our 2018 elections and beyond, because I'm confident they will continue until we stop them from doing so. So, Madam President, I would object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, Madam President.
The senator from Arizona.
I think it's regrettable that this was objected to. We will bring it back. The Majority Leader said that this is just a symbolic vote. It is. And symbolism is important. Obviously, we have underlying sanctions that we ought to fully implement. If there are waivers that are needed, there's a waiver process already in the NDAA authorization. And I support those waivers with regard to India. This does not affect that. This simply says, in a symbolic way, that we in the Senate don't buy Vladimir Putin's rejection or his denial of election interference. That was put in question this week, whether our government believes that or not. We here in the Senate should stand and say, we don't believe it. We know that the intelligence is right. We stand behind our intelligence community. We need to say that in the Senate. Yes, it's symbolic, and symbolism is important. Our agencies of government need to know that we stand behind them. That's what this is about. So I hope that we will pass this. I note regretfully that there's been an objection to it, but we'll bring it back. I believe that this should pass, and I believe it ultimately will pass. And with that, I yield back.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, the post-cloture time on the Bounds nomination expire at 1:45 p.m. today. Further, that if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that following disposition of the Bounds nomination, the Senate resume legislative session and proceed to the immediate consideration of a Schumer resolution that is at the desk. Further, that the Senate immediately vote on the resolution, that if agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection. The senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I just wanted to join my colleague from Arizona in briefly remarking on my regret that our resolution was not adopted today. It does call for the full implementation of mandatory sanctions provided for in CATSA, as discussed at some length. But it does not call for the reckless implementation of mandatory sanctions. There are a significant range of sanctions already provided for in this law, adopted by 98-2 by this body, that have not yet been adopted. I recognize that this resolution, standing strong behind the Department of Justice, the intelligence community, and its ongoing investigation is, as was referenced, a symbolic act. But there are moments when symbolism and standing together are important. And I look forward to continuing to work closely with my colleague and friend from Arizona to ensure that this resolution is adopted, that the American people and the men and women of our federal law enforcement agencies and our intelligence community understand that this body strongly supports them and their work and sees clearly the ongoing and continuing threat to our democracy posed by President Putin and Putin's Russia. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President,
The Democratic leader.
first, before I talk about the resolution that Senators Menendez, Schatz, and myself will be that we have authored, that will be voted on at 1:45, I'd like to say a few words about the work of my friends from Delaware and Arizona, and my severe disappointment that there was objection from the Republican leadership. The bottom line is very simple. President Trump has put our country in a foreign policy crisis. President Trump has weakened the security of this country. A resolution is the minimum we can do. The minimum. We should be acting. And the idea that we cannot even pass a resolution in this body because of the objection of the other side, when this was done in a bipartisan, careful way by the senators from Arizona and Delaware, shows something very bad. That our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so cowed by a president that they cannot stand up for national security. They cannot stand up to Vladimir Putin, just as the president seems not to be able to. And I'd say one more point. From what I am told, one of the major objections from the other side was the including of contemporaneous notes, that Congress wished that contemporaneous notes in that secret meeting for 2 hours be made available. That is key. What are they hiding? What are they afraid of? Don't the American people have a right to know what went on in that meeting, particularly when President Putin gets up and talks about some agreements that it seems not even our high-ranking officials in the state, defense, intelligence departments know about? This is amazing. We have come to a really low moment in this body when a bipartisan resolution that is rather modest, that was limited. I had talked to my friend from Delaware. He knows I wanted much more in this resolution. But in effort to get something done, we limited it. My view, the view of most Americans, the notes should be made available. The translator should be made available. The translator wasn't specifically referred to in this resolution, but when they talked about relevant people coming, my view, and I believe the view of the senator from Delaware, was that that would include the translator. I'm not sure if it was the view of my friend from Arizona, but it doesn't matter. We're not even passing this resolution. I have to say, this was a moment for bipartisanship. This was a moment for America pulling together. This was a moment when the president doesn't serve the country well, that Americans of all parties, all ideologies come together and fill that void and undo the misdeeds that occurred in Helsinki. Unfortunately, because of weakness, fear. My guess is if you looked inside the hearts and minds of every member on the other side, all but maybe one or two would feel this is the right resolution. But they're afraid. Fear will not get us anywhere. Letting a bully push us around, meaning President Putin, as he pushed President Trump around, will not serve this country well. It's a sad moment that this resolution was rejected. Now, before I yield to my good friend, the hardworking and very, very able head of the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I just want to talk on our resolution, which we are going to get a vote on. Lord knows if we couldn't have even gotten a vote on that. The idea that an American ambassador who served us so well should be brought before Putin and his minions to be questioned when there is no charge against him, no issue against him. It's not like the 12 Russians who were indicted for trying to interfere with our elections. There's not even an analogy. There's not even an evenness. And President Trump amazingly called this an incredible offer. Our president is saying that one of our ambassadors to be hauled before an authoritarian regime that twists the truth, that lies at will, that even seems to kill people they want to with poison in other countries. And that's an incredible offer? Well, this resolution...
Thanks for coming. Just have a few minutes here for other engagements, but really appreciate the turnout. And we just offered resolution, a non-binding resolution, just saying that we stand with our intelligence community, that the DOJ did a great job putting together these indictments of Russian officials, that we do not buy the denial of Vladimir Putin. We regret that our president did during that meeting, that we should fully and immediately implement the sanctions that we passed by a vote of 98-2, and that we stand with our intelligence agency. That's the most important thing, and we regret that it was objected to. We will bring it back on Tuesday of next week for another vote. I hope that those who objected reconsider.
Thank you. I just want to thank my friend and colleague, Senator Flake of Arizona. We recently traveled together on a trip led by Senator Flake, joined by the Republican chairman of Foreign Relations in the Senate and in the House, and Senator Udall. And we met with leaders throughout the region, in two countries in particular, Finland and Latvia, that have Russian borders. We went to centers that are designed to help those countries stand in the face of ongoing Russian interference in their civil society, in their elections, in their communications, and to prepare for what they view very clearly as a Russian threat. These are countries that have faced a Russian occupation within living memory. It's striking to me that in the Helsinki summit that followed, just 10 days after our visit to Helsinki, our president failed to clearly side with our intelligence community and our federal law enforcement in the indictments that he knew about that were released just before that summit. So I was grateful for a chance to join with Senator Flake. I was expecting that it would be adopted by unanimous consent. I was surprised that a senator objected. He basically said this is symbolic and it's time for substantive action. But I think symbolic statements by the entire Senate at this moment, when our own intelligence community, our own professionals in federal law enforcement don't know what to make of the constantly shifting whiplash of back and forth statements that either say there are great people on both sides, or I'm not sure who to agree with, or no, I'm clear that Russia did interfere in our election. The Senate should stand clearly with the conclusions of our own intelligence community. Our former colleague, Senator Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, who has reaffirmed unquestionably that Russia interfered in our last election and is continuing to attempt to interfere in our next. There are substantive actions we should take. The resolution specifically calls for them. And I'm grateful to Senator Flake for his leadership, and I look forward to working with him next week when we return to insist on another vote on this resolution.
Let me just say, Senator Coons worked with his caucus most of the Democratic caucus wanted far stronger language. And we were able to pull them back to get something that we felt could pass with both sides supporting. A symbolic effort, but as he mentioned, this is when a symbolic vote is needed right now to let our intelligence community know that we stand with them and to let Vladimir Putin know that we don't buy his denial.
Senator Flake, what does it mean that a member of your party objected to this? Does this muddy your message in pushing back on the president? Is this bad for the party and for the country?
Obviously, I think it is. I think that we ought to stand up and say we stand with the intelligence community. We don't believe the words of a dictator. And I think that hurts the party for Republicans to not take that message to the floor right now, to not take that message.
Senator Flake, you spoke about enablers in your speech on the Senate floor. To what role has your own party played in enabling the kind of behavior that we've seen in the past week?
Well, I talked in this speech and one in January about being enablers of untruths. I mean, a lot of things like crowd size and whatever else may not mean much on their face, but when it continues and we don't call it out, then it muddies the waters. And we come to a situation like we did in Helsinki, where there's simply confusion. It's like Orwell's 1984, as I just mentioned. Well, yeah, I do. I've said before, I think that our party needs to stand up more and say, this is wrong, this is untrue, and I think that we'd be better off for it politically, and certainly the country's better off for it.
Senator Flake, the Republicans who have been most vocal on this issue are all retiring this year, including yourself. This non-binding resolution was blocked almost as soon as it was proposed. Why do you have faith that the Senate will do anything?
All we can do is keep trying, and that's why we put together a bipartisan bill. As he mentioned, we travel together to these countries. I can tell you, being in Latvia and hearing the Latvian government, who hears propaganda out of Moscow every day, playing to 40% of their population, which is Russian-speaking, to hear that NATO is weak, that America is an unreliable ally, and then to hear those messages reinforced last week at the NATO summit and then again in Helsinki, it hurts all of us.
Why do you think your Republican colleagues don't find that argument convincing?
Some of them do. I think they do, and I think some, and we've heard a number of them speak out. I hope that not just individuals, but our leadership as well will take, certainly we need to do substantive action. We've got to find out what the Russian ambassador was referring to yesterday when he said that important agreements were reached. We don't know. We have no idea. We've got to find that out. There are certain things that have to be taken, but today, to not agree to a symbolic resolution simply saying we stand with our intelligence community and don't believe the denials of a dictator, it should have been passed.
And a key piece of this resolution was asking for prompt oversight hearings. I'm encouraged there is some initial signals that there may be relevant hearings, but it's important for us to demand them as a Senate and to ask for relevant notes and to ask for the Secretary of State to brief us on foreign relations. We shouldn't be just guessing based on the statements of the Russian ambassador or based on things we hear reported in the media, as valuable as that is. We should be able to question senior leaders who were in the room preparing our president before and debriefed him after his summit with Vladimir Putin.
Does that include getting the notes or talking to the interpreter who was actually the only person in the room? Do you want to speak with her, get the notes, have her prepare for?
I think we're both sensitive to classified material that might be there, and we want it in the appropriate venue. But let's face it, the interpreters were the only ones there.
And that's the only way to really know what happened, and I think it's appropriate that those be
in terms of notes.
Released.
But I'm not talking about, in a subpoena to the interpreter. I hope it doesn't come to that. It shouldn't. I would hope that those notes, all interpreters take notes, would be turned over. We need to know. Russia's going to play this game. They're already out there talking about important agreements being reached, and they will, over the next while, characterize those agreements in the way that they want to. And if we have no way of pushing back, or if the administration doesn't push back, then we've got a big problem.
You have an own party who doesn't push back. So how do you convince your own colleagues?
One more question.
Senator, you used the words in your speech, aid and comfort, that the president gave aid and comfort to Vladimir Putin. Any coincidence that is the constitutional definition?
No, that was not intended at all. I'm just saying that when you don't call out the Russian president for a blatant untruth that was said, then we're lending him support. He will take that and use it. He probably already is. So I think that that's wrong.
Can I ask you, when you go overseas and speak to these countries, is the message now trust the United States Senate and not the White House, not the President of the United States?
I can just say for our message, we let people know that, as Senator McCain tweeted out a while ago, majority of Americans and bipartisan majorities in the Congress have supported free trade, for example, and our alliances and support our allies. That's the message we bring. It's not a negative message on the administration. It's just a message that they have support.
And I think it was important for us on a bipartisan basis as 5 members, 2 very senior members, chairs of their respective committees, to meet with presidents, prime ministers, speakers of parliament, ministers of defense and foreign affairs, and reinforce the value that we as Americans of both parties have for our economic, security, diplomatic and political relationships with the 4 countries that we visited, 2 NATO allies and 2 close security partners, countries that have sacrificed their own sons and daughters fighting to protect us in Afghanistan, should not worry that because of a tariff or a tweet that somehow that is less valued. We delivered a positive message of reinsurance.
Senators, can you talk more about the tariffs, possible tariffs that would be placed on auto imports that would affect NATO allies? This is all
Speaking for me, I think it'd be a terrible idea and would further divide us from some of our most important, closest allies.
I completely agree.
Senator Flake, can you characterize
Thank you.
how much support you have now within the Republican conference for your resolution as it's framed right now?
I know of nobody else who had an objection. It was just an objection from Republican leadership. So you'd have to ask other members.
Have you had expressions of support?
Certainly from some, but I haven't canvassed them all.
And fair to say, Senator,
Thank you.
this caught you off guard? I say, fair to say that this caught him off guard. And he said yes. The rejection, yeah.
Thanks for asking.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry.